You are listening to episode 88 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. David Chapman speaks with us about Buddhism for vampires in our second Halloween special. Hi everyone, and happy Halloween! Today we're going to celebrate my personal favorite holiday with our second Halloween special. The focus is on David Chapman's website, Buddhism for Vampires. David is educated and has worked in the fields of science, engineering, and business, which have each taught him to ask skeptical questions from their own perspectives. He applies this to his investigation of the Aro Buddhist tradition and blogs about his findings, interests, and ideas on several blogs including Meaningness, Approaching Aro, and of course, Buddhism for Vampires. So sit back, relax, and have a nice True Blood, AB negative with just a hint of O positive. And our guest today is David Chapman. David, thanks for being here.
Hi, Ted. Thanks for having me on.
That's great, and glad you're here for this Halloween episode. I wanted to mention to the listeners of the podcast that although you and I have gotten to know each other a bit more through your work on your blog, meaningness.wordpress.com, actually I first encountered you from another one of your sites. You do have a couple of them out there, and this one is in particular appropriate for our Halloween episode, and that is Buddhism for Vampires.com, and there are dashes in between those words, so it's Buddhism-for-vampires.com. David, you're going to be coming back as a guest on some other topics in another episode, so I'm going to skip our usual intro, tell us about yourself kind of stuff, and I want to skip ahead to Buddhism for Vampires. There's a little introduction verbiage you had in one of your other sites that talks about this, and I want to just read a sentence or two of that. Buddhism for Vampires is a playful yet deadly serious look at the dark side of Buddhism. We're all monsters, but we can embrace our monstrosity while retaining our human nobility. And I thought that was a really great segue because you have a lot of really neat things on the site. So I want to start by asking, how did you come to make the site? What's its purpose?
Well, I was inspired by Brad Warner, actually, who is a Zen teacher who does Buddhism for punks. And his perspective is that Buddhism has tended to have a pretty narrow audience in the West. There's a particular demographic. It mainly appeals to people in the baby boom generation, and it tends to be kind of holistic, politically correct people, and that's all great, but Buddhism doesn't need to be restricted to that kind of an audience. And so he's presenting it quite differently for punks, and I thought, what are some other ways of presenting it that could be attractive to other audiences? And this idea of Buddhism for Vampires came into my head pretty much as a joke because I like reading vampire fiction. And I thought,
you and I both.
yeah, it's a different kind of person, and there's definitely some overlap between Buddhists and vampire fiction readers, but it's not something that people would make an obvious connection. So that was just a joke, but then I started reading a little, and I discovered that there's actually an enormous amount of vampire lore in traditional Buddhism. It's not something that's at all alien. It's actually quite central in some parts of Buddhism, particularly in early Tantra. Um, so I'm drawing on the um, presentation of Tantra from the Indian Dark Age, which is around 700, and that's the milieu there is really very much like fantasy fiction, but rather a dark fantasy fiction. So there's wizards and heroes, and gods and demons, vampires and zombies, um, and it's all about sex and violence. And that's really, these are the themes in vampire fiction. So, partly this is just a different presentation, but also it's quite a different Buddhism. The mainstream Buddhism, um, both in Asia and in the West, is rooted in the monastic tradition, which is renunciate, and the tantric Buddhism is really very different, and I think in some ways it could be a better fit for a lot of Westerners. We're not really enthusiastic about renunciation and breaking all of our ties with the world and letting go of everything and sort of going into some kind of peaceful state. There is an attraction towards that. We all have that attraction, but there's not a lot of us who really want to go the whole way that way.
Yeah, it seems good as a concept, but actually taking the step, we're not quite a culture that's as prone to do that as some others.
Yeah. And, so for those of us who are, that's a great path. But uh, Tantra is explicitly a path for people who want to maintain involvement in the world, for whom romance and sex, and doing stuff, being involved in a community and so on. These are part of the path for Tantra, and so that's something I would like to get across.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things you do have on here is you talk a little bit about on the site vampires in Buddhist history, and you have an article called Tibetan Book of the Undead. Awesome title, love that one. And you talk about some of the different kinds of vampires that we've seen in the Buddhist tradition. And then you also go into some other themes, vampires, ambiguity, and paradox. And you do quote a few of my favorite authors here. Stephen Asma, someone that you have on here. And you and I have also chatted a bit about David McMahon and his
Yes.
making of modern Buddhism, which is a phenomenal book, which I've recommended to many people. And he's been on the podcast, as is Brad Warner, to talk about their work. You do have some links on here I want to share with people. One of them is essays, and you have a number of essays on here that are, and the Tibetan Book of the Undead is one of those. I'd like you to chat a little bit about that darker side you were talking about with Buddhism and vampires and that kind of interpretation. It's our Halloween episode, but we get to be serious sometimes too.
Mm. Yes. Well, I have an essay titled "We Are All Monsters," and this is not, I think, a good thing or a bad thing, but it is true. Um, it's just what we are. It's part of us. And so the tendency is to kind of pretend that we are not, that we're well-behaved human beings, and this can end badly.
Yes.
The I talk about the Stanley Milgram's torture experiments, which is something I think everybody really ought to know about. This is back in, I think, the 60s. He found that most Americans, if pushed a little bit, would torture somebody to death. He faked the torture and the deaths, but the people who were in the experiment actually thought they were doing this. And that's it's unbelievable that people would do this, but it's been repeated and it really seems to
Yeah.
be true.
It is. I think we discussed that a bit with Carol Tavris in her discussion of cognitive dissonance, that you get people to do things that are normally very alien to them and that they wouldn't do, or would be really shocked if you told them, yeah, you would do this, one rationalization, one step at a time, and that they find themselves really at the opposite end of the spectrum where they think they would be. But what that shows is we do have that in us. We can do
Yeah.
this. And Milgram's experiments really showed that. And as you said, like any good experiment, it's repeatable. We can show this
Yeah.
again and again.
Yeah, so I mean that's scary, and I think I'm a good person. I imagine you think you're a good person, but statistically, we might do that. So I think the first step to making it less likely that we will is to acknowledge that that is part of us, and um, when we do that, and accept that not as something that we will do, but that as a potential, then the power of that, because there is a power there, that can be mixed with the nobility that all people also have. We don't want to admit that we're monsters, but we also don't want to admit that we're heroes. And actually, everybody would like to pretend they're ordinary, but we are both monsters and heroes at the same time. And if we acknowledge that, then there is a path, particularly within Tantra, of integrating those things. And, the goal is to become a cheerful, kind, useful monster who is also an overpowering, unpredictable, and dangerous hero. That's really the tantric ideal, and that is something that we have a means for.
When you were describing that, I had a sudden flash of uh, Ludo from Labyrinth, the big Jim Henson giant beast who's really quite sweet and very cuddly, but he's a monster.
Mm,
And a lot of the monsters in that are heroes, and I always find an appeal, and I think this is part of the appeal of vampire novels, is the anti-hero. I like the
yeah.
bad guy's perspective, the ones we typically consider the bad guy.
Mm,
And one of the things you were just saying about how this is we have the dark side to us, and that has an appeal, and we think of ourselves as not being that way, fits very well with that duality of what the romantic version of vampires, where they're a noble creature who's has this curse and they can't help themselves, and there's this monster part of them.
mm,
And you also wrote in your essay "Eating the Shadow" about, so we're all monsters. Then what? What do we
yeah.
do with that? Let's talk about that for a minute. So we've realized, yes, that horrible thing is in us. We could conceivably be the kind of person who tortures someone to death. What do we do about that? What does Buddhism have to contribute to changing that, or is that even something we need to change?
Well, the potentiality isn't something that we can change, but by seeing it clearly, um, there's the transformation of that from something that is uncontrollable, chaotic, and unknown. It's alien. When it ceases to be alien, then it's something that you can use instead of something that might erupt unpredictably and cause a lot of damage. And, just really basic meditation where you're experiencing your own experience, your own emotions, your thoughts without judgment, that you're not going to erupt and do something monstrous while you're sitting on the cushion, but you see this. And when you see it, you kind of chew through it. This is the eating the shadow metaphor, is that you're chewing on it, and you're chewing on it in order to actually digest it, and then it becomes part of you. So it's no longer the not me. It's no longer horrifying and alien. It's just something that's there and that's usable.
Speaking of eating, let's use that segue to the article on dakinis.
Mm.
Tell us about dakinis.
Dakinis are the origin of Tantra, according to well, certainly according to the tantric scriptures themselves, and also perhaps according to Western historians. They're witches. They are women or goddesses or female spirits. There's a kind of ambiguity there, who perform magic and who are the ones who gave Tantra to humankind, which unfortunately for the era that tended to mean mankind. But dakinis now can mean female practitioners. Um, there's a historical theory which is very interesting, which is that they were a an ethnic group, the female shamanic priestesses of an ethnic group in India around 700, and the Buddhists who created Buddhist Tantra were adopted by these women into their rites and rituals, and there's a kind of a cultural hybridization in which the Buddhists took elements of this magical system and merged it into Buddhism to create what we now have as Vajrayana.
And one other thing I do want to ask about here, and then we'll go on to the Vitali's gift, because I want you to chat about that as well, is you have an article on here about Buddhists who kill.
Mm.
And that is a very challenging subject, because
Yes.
we in the West have perhaps some different views about this, especially when you get down to things like euthanasia.
Hmm.
We have conversations with monastics who are, they are following what the teaching is, which is killing is wrong, and a that kind of killing is really, there's an aversion there, and that's not good, and regardless of the circumstances. And to a Westerner, that may be more of an issue of compassion for someone or something. Your pet is suffering terribly from some very painful illness or age, infirmity, and you can't explain it to them. All they know is that there is now pain and suffering, and you want to let them go. But traditionally, you can't. That's an aversion. That's killing, and that's wrong. And so there is a great deal of controversy there. Uh, Tell us about that.
Well, that controversy's been going for um, near on 2,000 years. Um, there is the Pali Canon seems to be quite clear and unambiguous on that point. But once you get into Mahayana, people start to say, "Oh, well, aren't there cases in which killing can be compassionate?" Certainly, the example you give of an animal who is in dire pain or maybe terminal, that seems like the compassionate thing to do, maybe to kill. And um, there's a kind of a progression, and there's always a worry that we're going down a slippery slope here to the point where we could justify an aggressive war using Buddhism. And there's cases in history where people have done exactly that. So there's, I feel that there's no right answer here. I think it's worth mentioning something that may not be very well known, which is that in Buddhist Tantra, in some systems at least of Buddhist Tantra, the practitioner takes a vow to kill, including to kill human beings, if that's the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find that's very interesting. You talk about Shantarakshita here, one of the Buddhist philosophers and a founder of Tibetan Buddhism, and you say that must transcend the rules of conventional morality, such as the precept against killing, when motivated by compassion. And I find that very interesting because a new book about Santa Rakshita is coming out by Marie. I'm going to butcher her name. My apologies, Marie Frequengon, and she's sending that to me. So I'm eager to read that. It's funny to see that on your site the same week that has come up as a topic. So
Oh, that's very interesting. He actually is one of the main characters in my tantric Buddhist romance, vampire romance novel. Um,
let's talk about that. Great segue. Well done. You're hired. Tell us about the Vitali's Gift, which is at least part of it is on the site, I believe.
yes, I'm running it as a serial. I started writing it about 2 years ago, and I had what I thought was a nearly complete draft after 6 or 9 months. And I thought, well, I'll put an episode out every week. Um, it turned out that there were some little gaps in there, which turned out to be a little bit difficult to fill. So it's not running quite as smoothly as I would like, but there is a complete story there. It is it's a vampire romance in somewhat the tradition of the Anita Blake books.
Yeah,
For
yeah.
those that know those, you know those.
Oh, I know those very well, and well, we'll talk about that in a minute.
Hmm. She's sort of my inspiration for a lot of this in a
Hmm.
way.
Hmm.
Uh, it's set in the Dark Age in India around 700. It's about the origins of Buddhist Tantra and how it got to Tibet. And it's um, it's a lighthearted novel. At the same time, it is horrifying. There's some episodes that I hope people find difficult. It's also under the surface, although it's playful and easy to read, I hope. There's quite a lot of serious Buddhist material and philosophy that I'm working into it that weaves through it. That's not so obvious in the episodes that are there yet because those just treat the hero's childhood, but it'll become more obvious shortly, I hope.
Hmm. I'm glad, and this is here, so people can take a look at that on the site. Let's talk about Anita Blake and some contemporary uh, vampire novelizations. It's interesting you brought that up because my roommate and I both love those books. When they were
Mm.
first coming out, we were going through them, um, and I know there's been a progression in the writing style of the author. I'll put it that way, diplomatically, who I've met at fantasy conventions and so on, and it got to a point that this had become something beyond what it was. That the main character had
Yes.
really she'd gone over the edge of monster, and it became a little too graphic even for me. And I'm not a prude, so there were some changes there. But that made me I found much more appeal in the Suki Stackhouse
Hmm.
series after that. And I'm just noticing on the contents you have a one of the chapters is Suki spelled differently, but it made me think of Suki Stackhouse.
Yeah, that's a little joke.
Yeah,
It's
nicely done.
Suki is the female character whose full name is Sukadevi, which means bliss goddess. But of course, it is a homage to the Suki Stackhouse novels.
It was nice to see that. That was really good. So what is it that with this book that you're serializing, what is it that you're hoping the readers will get out of that most?
Um, well, what I'd most like is for readers to um, grasp the tantric attitude to life, and some might be inspired to go on to formally practice tantric Buddhism. Probably not very many, but perhaps if some can take away that attitude or approach to um, dealing with the horror of life in a way that is skillful and joyful in spite of the horror. That's what I would most hope for.
And our guest today that we've been talking with is David Chapman. The website we've been talking about today is buddhism-for-vampires.com. Go check it out. The things we've been talking about, the links to the essays and to the serialized novel are all there. And you should also make a point of going out to David's WordPress account, and that's meaningness.wordpress.com. Along with all the other interviews, I will have an episode page for this episode, so everything we've mentioned here will be linked on that episode page. David, I really appreciate your time with us, and happy Halloween.
Thank you, Ted. It's been great being on.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for the Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.